YouTube. Great. Well, welcome back to another talk in our Unsilencing the Archives series. I'd like to welcome you all via YouTube. My name is Aaron Brody. I'm the director of the Bade Museum and professor at Pacific School of Religion. And before we get to our introductions to our distinguished speaker, I'd like to yield the floor to Jess Johnson, who has a word to say from the Bade Museum.
Hello, everyone. We would like to begin by acknowledging that Berkeley, California is on the territory of the Huchun, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone. We respect the land and the people who have stewarded it throughout many generations, and we honor their elders, both past and present. We are living in a moment that warrants deep reflection on our past, wherein even our most venerated figures deserve reasonable scrutiny. During his time directing the archaeological excavations at Tel El Nasba, W.F. Bade participated in harmful stereotyping of Palestinian Arabs that was common among white Americans and Europeans conducting fieldwork in British Mandate Palestine. Some of these attitudes appear in print in his popular 1934 book, A Manual of Excavation in the Near East. Museums are also scrutinizing their collections, including evaluating the legal status and the ethics with which they were acquired. As stewards of the legacy of the Bade Museum and its holdings, it is our responsibility to faithfully evaluate the process by which the collections were acquired within the context of our contemporary moment. One approach is to ask due questions of the archival materials in order to examine critically the manner and the impact of archaeological work on Indigenous communities and to investigate the colonial conditions in which it played a part. The Bade Museum recognizes that its location and collection are part of ongoing and painful colonial legacies that contributed to historical inequalities. These legacies have directly and indirectly impacted populations locally and abroad in Palestine, where the excavations were conducted under the authority of the British Mandate government of Palestine. In an effort to bring light to these issues, to serve a broader public audience online, and to connect to the local community that it serves, the museum is taking action to become a more inclusive, welcoming, and equitable institution that practices the philosophy of radical inclusion adopted by its parent institution, Pacific School of Religion. One of these steps is the creation of open access web exhibitions and public programming like this lecture series, which highlight decolonizing themes. We invite you to participate in these programs so that together we can listen, learn, and work toward creating a more inclusive museum community. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Jess. And I'm happy also to yield the floor to Felicity Cobbing. She can be back on the call. She was going to do a brief introduction on behalf of the PEF and then introduce our speaker today.
Thank you very much, Aaron. So I'm going to start with a similar statement from the PEF. The PEF fully endorses the Bade Museum statement on decolonization and supports their efforts in this regard. As a funding organization, we were very pleased to support the Bade Museum's project to create an online exhibition to highlight the lives and work of the Arab workforce at the Tel El Nasba excavations. And these online lectures exploring the contribution of the local population to the archaeology of Palestine. As another Western colonial era organization, our own history shares many of the same characteristics which have just been described, and we are keen to play our part in this process, both as co-hosts of these lectures and with our own initiatives. So now I would very much like to introduce our speaker for tonight to talk about colonial archaeology in mandatory Palestine, Dr. Hamdan Taha. Now, Hamdan Taha gained his PhD from the Free University of Berlin. He is the former Deputy Minister and Assistant Deputy Minister for Heritage in Palestine. That's between 2004 and 2014. And he served between 1994 and 2004 as the Director General of the newly established Department of Antiquities in Palestine. He has directed a series of excavations and restoration projects and was the national coordinator of the World Heritage Programme in Palestine from 2002 to 2014. He is now an independent researcher and is currently coordinator of the Palestine History and Heritage Project, for which he has recently co-authored an introductory volume, New Critical Approach to the History of Palestine. He is the author of many other books, field reports, and scholarly articles, and he is also unfailingly generous with his expertise, which we will benefit from tonight. So thank you. Over to you, Hamdan.
Thank you very much. Good morning, California time, and good evening, Ramallah time. I'm especially pleased to be part of this lecture series on archaeological labor in the mandate period, revealing museum archives. Thank you, Aaron, Felicity, and Jess for the kind invitation to talk on Palestinian narratives in archaeology under this impressive motto, Unsilencing the Archive. My presentation is titled Colonial Archaeology in the Mandatory Period in Palestine, and I would like to say that I'm very moved with the statement of Ms. Jess Johnson and Felicity Copping about decolonization. Our part of the world is still far from this recognition, unfortunately. I would like first to mention that history is not just a better past for Palestinian people, but rather a living tragedy. Palestinians are still suffering the injustices that these colonial policies have brought on them in many aspects. Archaeology and politics have always been deeply intertwined in this place. Palestine as the Holy Land had been the site of Western imaginary and fantasy. In these fantasies, Palestine is the land without people. It is the mysterious Orient. However, all these assumptions have influenced and shaped universal historical record of Palestine. Through them, the history of this place had been distorted and blurred. The history of archaeological excavation in Palestine is also a history of colonial erasure, theft, and silencing. Historically, so many narratives about this place had been disregarded and silenced. The rich and complex history of all the people and the groups who had lived in this land. Palestinian narrative attempt to dismantle the Puritan record of this land. It aims to offer rich and inclusive narrative based on material evidence, which include all culture, ethnicities, voices, religious creeds. Moreover, it strives to honor all of the people and nations that had across history contributed to this place. Palestinian archaeologists do not only work under extreme measures, but they have to fight and challenge decades and centuries of false assumptions about the history of this rich and particular place. In recent years, some studies of decolonization appeared. I would like to acknowledge the work of Elena Corbett, study Salim Tamari, Beatrice Lawrence, Sarah Irving, and many others on some aspects of the colonial period and the role of the Department of Antiquities in the mandate period. Some basic ideas in my article were discussed in depth in my article, Palestinian Historical Narrative, published in the book, which have been mentioned by Felicity, New Critical Approach to the History of Palestine, edited by Thomas Thompson, Ingrid Helm, Ilan Poppy, and myself. I would like to share. Yeah, this is the flyer which has been prepared by the organizer. It shows the name of the Department of Antiquities as part of the government of Palestine. However, Palestine began to attract Western explorer and archaeologists almost since 19th century, which witnessed the birth of archaeology as a scholarly discipline. This was demonstrated by the exploration work of Citizen Robinson, Smith, Van der Velde, and others. Those explorers were motivated by the idea of the study of the Bible, as you know. The comprehensive survey of Western Palestine conducted by Cornell and Kitchener 1871-1877 gave the scientific or sort of historical articulation to the term Holy Land by mapping it. These early explorations were followed by the first excavation carried out at Tel el-Hissi, Tel el-Sultan, Gezer, Jerusalem, Tel Ta'anak, and other sites. This period witnessed a great competition between traditional colonial powers, especially Britain and France, over the acquisition of antiquities of the dying out empire, Ottoman Empire. As part of the Ottoman modernization process started in the late 19th century, the first edict regulating antiquities in Ottoman period was issued. The first archaeological museum was established in Jerusalem in the late Ottoman period. It was a joint venture of the Ottoman authorities, local and archaeologists working in the Palestine Exploration Fund. The museum, called the Imperial Museum or Museum in Turkish, or Imperial Museum, was the first enterprise in this direction. The preparation of the museum was carried out under the auspices of Ismail al-Husseini, Mufti and Director of Education, Ma'arif in Jerusalem, with a museum director and a committee. The British archaeologist Place was involved actively in preparing and inventorying the collection and curating the archaeological display. He used biblical terminology used in the description of object as Israelite, pre-Israelite, etc. This collection was the core of the Palestine Museum of Antiquities. Between 1919 and 1930, established by the Department of Antiquities of the British Mandate Civil Administration, followed the British occupation of Palestine after the Second World War. The Palestine Museum of Antiquities was housed in a building called Warehouse and organized by the Department of Antiquities. It was inaugurated in 1921. I will move to talk a little bit about the mandate Department of Antiquities, which was the core of my presentation. Palestine, as you know, fell under the British occupation after the end of the World War I. In accordance with secret deal between Sykes and Picot between England and France, the two main colonial powers between the two world wars. Britain and France divided the Arabs into states under their rule, and Palestine had been promised as a Jewish national home. Antiquities were one of the main spoils of the war. Sir Frederick Kenyon, president of the British Academy, proposed to put it under the custody of the Allies, as it was described by Elena Corbett. In the mandatory period, archaeology was part of a much larger colonial policy. The British sought to own antiquities and their narrative and to incorporate it into their colonial policy generally. Following the British occupation in 1918, a proclamation. Here, just to go, that was the first excavation carried out at Tel el-Hissi. This is Flinders B3, Sir Flinders B3. And here is the headquarters of the Palestine, the first museum in Jerusalem, in Al-Ma'muniyah School, established by during the late Ottoman period. A proclamation for the protection of antiquities was issued by the British military government. In 1920, the Department of Antiquities was established by the civil administration under Higher Commissioner Herbert Samuel. Antiquities Ordinance defining, that comes here, of course, defining the function and authority of the new department was issued in the same year. The ordinance was replaced in 1929 and was amended in 1934 and 1946. The ordinance aimed to organize archaeological research in Palestine and to ensure British control over archaeological strategy in Palestine. However, the law legalized division of finds, export and sale of antiquities as well. That is the building of the first department of antiquities in the Way House. Only the gate is still preserved. The department was headed by a director and organized into 4 subunits: inspector, a record office and a library, conservation laboratory, a photographic studio, and the Palestine Museum as well. The director of the Department of Antiquities of the advisory board were appointed by the High Commissioner from the British, French, American, and Italian schools of archaeology. In Jerusalem, 2 Palestinian Muslim and 2 Jews were also appointed to represent the interest of Muslims and Jewish cultural heritage. The policymaking body was dominated by non-indigenous archaeologists, as it is evidence in the structure of the advisory board. The structure showed as if the Palestinians are not able to care of their own archaeology. To ensure the role of the British government on archaeology in post-Ottoman era, Dr. Frederick Kenyon, the director of the British Museum, established the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem. Dr. Garstang of the University of Liverpool was appointed as a director of this school. Garstang also served as advisor to the mandate authorities at the base of High Commissioner for formulation of the Palestine Antiquities Ordinance, which provide the institutional framework of the Department of Antiquities. 3 British directors, here we see them, are John Garstang, 1920-26, Ernest Richmond, 1937, and Robert Hamilton, 1938-84. Ernest Richmond served as a consulting architect to the restoration work of in the middle, here we see him, of the Haram al-Sharif in Jerusalem between 1918-1920, and afterward as assistant of civil security of the government of Palestine, 1920-1926, a post from which he resigned in protest against the pro-Zionist policy of the British government. Richmond was succeeded by Robert Hamilton in 1936, who served till 1948 as a director of the Department of Antiquities. Here we see him in the left of the slide. Richmond was Hamilton served as a chief inspector and director of the department. and director of the department for almost 12 years. Among his important work are his studies of the history of the Church of Nativity and the Aqsa Mosque. He joined Baranki, the excavation at Khirbet al-Mafjar, and wrote his monumental publication about the site 1959. The publication led to some friction between the two, Baranki and Hamilton. The department was located, as said, in the Way House north of the Damascus Gate. The Palestinian Archaeological Museum, which was managed by the Department of Antiquities, was also accommodated in the same building until 1935, when it moved to the department when the department moved to the new building donated by Rockefeller, which was opened to the public in 1938. The Way House building was occupied also by the British School of Archaeology, established in 1919 and continued until 1930. Lina Corbett showed in her review of the complex history of the relation between Palestine and Transjordan in the Mandate period. In 1936, the British archaeologist Lancaster Harding was appointed as a chief inspector of antiquities in Transjordan to succeed Hotsfeld between 1936 and 1946, and later as director of antiquities. He was the acting curator of the Palestinian Archaeological Museum in Jerusalem. His involvement in the Dead Sea Scroll continued till in the mid of 50s, when he was dismissed by the Jordanian government. The main objective of the department was in line with the British Mandate policy to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine as an implementation of Balfour Declaration. The main focus of the British policy and research was to recognize the historicity of the Jewish presence in Palestine. It was, of course, supplemented with the Jewish migration from the West under the British Mandate to realize this promise. The new department in Palestine was staffed by Britain's Palestinian, Muslim, Jews, Christians. The department has a multi-ethnic and multi-confessional character where people were working together. However, it was demonstrated by several researchers that the British policy was unbalanced between Arabs and Jews, as demonstrated by Iglock and Sarah Irving. This was reflected more clearly in the role and responsibilities of the department staff, as have been demonstrated in the analysis of the employee chart of mandate management structure devoted to archaeology of Palestine. A few Palestinians had higher positions and the majority are low status positions. Furthermore, the mandate authorities treated Palestinian archaeological heritage as if it has nothing to do with the living native population in Palestine. Nadia Abul Hajj, in her book Facts on the Ground, pointed out that the British mandate treated the Palestinian heritage not as a national heritage, but rather as universal. This was reflected in the management structure of the heritage management bodies created by the mandatory government. Edward Said argued that universalism of modern disciplines such as archaeology and heritage management was Eurocentric in this extreme. The Department of Antiquities, however, undertook a large number of excavations focusing mainly on biblical sites. The department sponsored scholarly journals dedicated to revelations sponsored by the department, whose lifespan corresponds to the life of the British rule, 1920-1948. The quarterly of the Department of Antiquities, Palestine, abbreviated as KIDAP. It was dominated by British scholars, though both Palestinian locals, Christian Jews were publishing in this journal. And it was a forum for scientific publication. The main Palestinian contributor were Dimitri, Jalil Baranki, Salim Hosseini, Makhouli, Nassar, and Hanna Stephen, and others. Related to the department, of course, is the Palestine Archaeological Museum. It was the new building of the Palestine Archaeological Museum that opened in 1938, was enabled by a grant of $2 million given to the Department of Antiquities in 1928 by John Rockefeller. The land was purchased from Al-Khalili family in Karm al-Sheikh, and the museum was designed by the British architect Austin Harrison, the mandatory government chief architect. The construction of the Palestine Archaeological Museum began 1930 and was completed in 1935 and opened to its doors to the public in 1938. The new museum collection was intended to include material that shed light on the history of humankind in Palestine. The British John Elief was the keeper of the museum from its beginning to 1948. This is the building of the museum, known as that is John Elief, the keeper of the museum. I may move to some indigenous voices. The first generation of Palestinian archaeologists and ethnographers emerged in the early 20th century, among them Yusra, Dimitri Baranki, Naim Makhouli, Salim Al-Husseini, Jalil Baranki, and Najib Nassar. Najib Makhouli studied at the British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem and was appointed inspector in the Department of Antiquities from 1920 to 1948. He excavated several sites, including Asfia and Khuraz and Al-Jesh, and conducted the restoration of Qal'at al-Qarn Montifort. He published his report in Kidab and authored a Guide to Acre, 1941. Visiting his sons in Beirut in 1948, he was unable to return to his village, Kafr Asfia, and died in Beirut in 1976. Al-Husseini, inspector of antiquities in Jerusalem area, left behind a series of published archaeological reports as well as unpublished reports, including an article on the excavation of the rock-cut burial at Beit Netif. Nassar published a widely quoted catalogue of the Arabic mints in Palestine and the Transjordan. Two archaeologists, those are some of the local archaeologists, that is on the top, Khalil Tota and Omar Salih al-Barouti, authored a book about the history of Palestine, and below down is Yusra. But two archaeologists of particular note are Baranki Brothers. Jalil Baranki served as a keeper of the Archaeological Museum. He drew up the discipline. His younger brother, Dimitri, who is frequently called the first Palestinian archaeologist. Dimitri Baranki started his career as a field archaeologist and was promoted Inspector of Antiquities in 1929. In 1934, he earned his BS degree in archaeology from the University of London and his PhD there in 1953. He excavated numerous sites across Palestine, including Tal el-Hassan, Tirul Abu Alaik, and Umayyad Palace of Khirbet el-Mafjar in Jericho, which was the subject of his pioneering doctoral dissertation. After the Nakba, Baranki worked as acting curator of the Palestinian Archaeological Museum before returning to Jericho with the American School of Oriental Research until 1951. When he joined the American University of Beirut. The involvement of the Palestinian women in archaeological field work began with some of the first excavations in Palestine, although their names did not appear in reports. Photos show women in the excavation of archaeological sites at Tel Ta'anek, Tel el-Sultan, Tel Balata, Tel el-Hissi, Gezer, and many other sites. Between 1928 and 1935, the cave of Shukba and Mount Carmel were excavated by the British archaeologist Dorothy Garrod, who worked with a team composed primarily of local Palestinian women. The very first Palestinian female archaeologist we know was Yusra from either Idzim or Jab'a in the Haifa region. Both villages were demolished and depopulated in 1948. Yusra became the most expert of the women employed by Garrod and was appointed forewoman. She worked alongside Jacquita Hawks and Kitson Clark. In 1932, whilst working at Tabun Cave, she found a tooth which turned out to be part of a human skull known as Tabun 1, belonging to a female adult of Neanderthal. Her finding was one of the most important human fossil discoveries ever, yet her lasting contribution to early archaeology went unacknowledged and her story forgotten until it was taken up recently by Pamela Smith.
Dr. Hamdan? Sorry, there's some questions from
yes.
The audience is wondering if you can enlarge the image that you're sharing. There's a
yeah. Nadi Dalia Samar.
There's I think it's called
yeah, sure.
Oh no, if you do the if you hit present.
Is it okay?
Well, it's now. I'm sorry.
So that is. Oh, sorry.
The fourth hieroglyph from the left. I think it's a presenter's view. No, not the percentage. Just next to that. Just to the left.
اوكي لحظة خليني عشان نزلتها بابا.
لحظة أنا بحكي كمان.
بس بدهم تكبير الصورة.
اسألهم.
كمان. Is it okay? لا بس في الكاس هون في الكاس اللي تحت.
I think it's called presenter's view.
Okay.
You see where there's a hieroglyph with yellow?
Yes, it is. It is.
If you go 3 to the right, I think it's called slideshow.
Slideshow.
Next to where it says 80%.
So
then it becomes full screen if you click on. So just next to the 80%. There. There we go.
Okay.
Well, it hasn't changed for me. I don't know. I don't know if the viewers. Thank you. Shukran.
Oh, thank you. So this is Yusra with Dorothy Garrod down below. That is the photo of Yusra. Okay, خلينا ننقلها لا خلينا. This is the photo of Dimitri Baranki showing him with his team working at Khirbet al-Mafjar, and as well as some photos from Hisham's palace, part of his discoveries of this early Islamic site. This is also true for the native discoverers of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Muhammad Dwib, who is never mentioned in or accredited in proper terms. These are also part of the experts of Al-Bina family who photographed the Dead Sea Scrolls. However, I will move quickly to another circles of first ethnographers working in the Palestinian Oriental Society. The Palestinian Oriental Society was established in 1920 with the assistance of the American Archaeologist A.T. Clay. It was held under the auspices of the Colonel Ronald Sturge, military governor of Jerusalem. The membership of the society had always been dominated by non-locals, most non-presidents. In 1932, there was 191 members, of which were 10 resident Palestinians, 20 were resident Jews, 42 were residents foreigners, and 117 were non-residents. The society sponsored a journal entitled Journal of the Palestine Oriental Society, GPOS. The main focus of this journal was on Palestinian studies. However, of the 335 articles published in GPOS from 1921 and 1948, 50 were by 7 Palestinian scholars. Most of them were by Tawfiq Canaan and Hannah Stephen. 92 were by 26 Jewish scholars, reflecting growing weight in number of the Jewish scholars in this period. Tawfiq Canaan, Omar Saleh al-Barghouti, Hannah Stephen contributed actively in recording the native Palestinian culture and Byzantry out of their concern that they were under threat and undermined by forces of modernity. The Palestinian ethnographer have a holistic and inclusive vision of culture, and they view this heritage of all accumulating culture, including Canaanite, Philistines, Hebraic, Nabateans, Syrians, Aramaic, Jewish, and Arab culture. Canaan was interested in particular in biblical studies, particularly the Old Testament, as one of the main sources of his studies of past and present Palestinian culture. His articles appeared alongside those of English and Jewish writers, most notably Eliezer ben Yehuda and Yitzhak ben Tzvi. His belief in the survival of ancient ethnographic features in Palestine was not guided by a desire to invoke a right of antiquity in legitimizing the presence of Palestinian. His main referential corpus was the Bible, but he also compared practices in Quran. In 1948, Canaan lost his house and his library in Jerusalem, as well as 3 manuscripts ready for publication. Yeah, I will end with a few words about archaeology and decolonization. In 1948, the name of Palestine was whipped out of maps. It was replaced by Israel, and approximately 1 million Palestinians were expelled from the areas proclaimed as belonging to the State of Israel. Three new entities were established on the ruins of the mandatory Department of Antiquities, the Israeli Department of Antiquities, which became in the entity which became Israel, while the Jordanian Department of Antiquities controlled the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip fell under Egyptian administration. Yeah, the British Secretary of State for Colonies, Oliver Stanley, declared that his government was pledged to guide colonial people along the road to self-government. However, the British colonial power deprived the Palestinian people from a fundamental right of self-determination, identified by United Nations as the core to decolonization. From the point of view of Palestinians, decolonization is perceived as a means to uncover their history and narrative. It is associated with truth, recognition, apology, as a way to end, to reach reconciliation, and by reclaiming and restoration of culture and political right and independence. I choose to end with this slide. This is the Tree of Life from Hisham's Palace. It is the mosaic which has been uncovered by the Palestinian archaeologist Dimitri Baranki. Thank you very much. Samar.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hamdan. We're beginning to get some questions in from the YouTube audience, and I'm hoping we can take a moment here and I can provide you with them. But perhaps first, if you don't mind closing your presentation.
Yes.
So that your images will be bigger then. Terrific. Thank you. So the first question.
You are very welcome.
Thank you. Shukran. Before the Antiquities Proclamation in 1929, what were the regulations, if any, governing excavation, export, or sale of antiquities?
Yeah, there was, as part of the modernization policy of the Ottoman government, the first law was issued in 1869 to defining antiquities, and it was modified in 1880s with the aim to regulate archaeological work, since there was, as I mentioned, great competition between European powers in Palestine, and also there was a series of excavation conducted. So it was aiming also to control the flow of antiquities from to abroad. However, there was an antiquities law during the late Ottoman period. In the beginning, it was not the proclamation of the British law of 1918 and 1920. So there was elements of legislations from the late Ottoman period.
Wonderful, thank you. So it sounds like the Ottoman law kind of came into the mandatory period as well, and then was modified.
And it was, in fact, Aaron, it was inspired from European laws. There was some expert from, I forget the name, who helped in Safwat Pasha in initiating the first laws of antiquities in the Ottoman Empire.
And I think Felicity Cumming from the PEF would like to ask a question.
Hi, lovely talk. Thank you very much, Dan. I just want to add that there's an awful lot of material in the Rockefeller Museum today that comes from that Ottoman period, that comes from that Ottoman legislation. So all the material from Geza, from the German Jericho excavations, from the Samaria excavations. These, there's a quantity of material in the Rockefeller Museum that is as a result of that Ottoman legislation. So the PEF projects that we excavated, places like Geza, Beth Shemesh, the material went into that museum, and
yes.
We, the European excavators in that period, before the mandate period, were granted, I suppose you could say, a token of the finds. And a lot in our collection from that period, from let's say the 1890s through to 1913, is actually casts. It's not original material.
Yeah, I think this is a chapter we need really to research more. I myself, working in archaeology, I learned really just in last years about the real story of the first Imperial Museum which was established in Jerusalem. And it was actually a joint venture between the Ottoman authorities and the British archaeologists, the Palestine Exploration Fund. First, Bliss was instrumental in that. He prepared the inventories and for the first museum, and also technical guidance for local authorities. Also, the local role was instrumental. It was people, local authorities in Jerusalem were very much involved in the preparation of the first museum, and it was housed in one of the most beautiful buildings during that time, the Ma'muniya School in Jerusalem. And I think till the beginning of the First World War, there was more than 10,000 objects registered in this museum. And it has been, during the war, it has been placed in a safe places in Jerusalem to protect these artifacts, and it it was the core of the museum of the Palestinian Archaeological Museum, which was inaugurated in 1920 by Ronald Storch, the military governor of Jerusalem during that time. And I think this probably the archives of the Palestine Exploration Fund will be especially important to throw more light on this formative period.
Yeah, I wrote an article with Jonathan Tubb on the first Palestinian museum. Exactly that museum back in '97, but it's in a very obscure article, so I'll email it to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And we have a few more questions from the YouTube audience. So if it's okay, I'll read the next one out. How did the British Department of Antiquities policies influence which projects or which people were granted excavation permits? Is there evidence of denial of permits on the basis of the cultural period of a site or the background of the applicants?
I think it was a very liberal policy. The British were very liberal to the point that they donated the country. So there was no problem also with managing archaeology. In this, it is known that they were granting excavation license where they were very liberal, probably at the end of the 1930s, with a growing tension with the German. Yes, they were not granted, and I don't know if they have applied. So that was, of course, a clear political reason in a way. But to my knowledge, I think that generally the policy of the mandate Department of Antiquities was generally very liberal in granting excavation permits.
Thank you. And then another question from the audience, but specifically from Mahmoud Hawari. He asks,
yes,
was there any handover of the mandate Department of Antiquities to any authority or person when the British withdrew from Palestine on the 14th of May, 1948?
Unfortunately, yes, there was. And I think this is also an issue which needs to be explored from probably the archives, secret archives. I think the Department of Antiquities was responsible of establishing an international committee for the museum to ensure that the museum is not managed by a national body after the 1948. And I think Hamilton was part of this conspiracy in a way, who was the late director of the Department of Antiquities. I think lately there was some records pointing to this issue, and that therefore probably yes, there was some influence in the last I would say moments of this department. Otherwise, it has been dismantled completely. The Palestinian employees working in the department were lost their at least in the land which has been proclaimed as Israel, they lost their jobs. And I brought the case of Naim Mahouli, thanks to Raz Kletter, who documented the case. He was the archaeological inspector of Galilee, and he was by chance visiting his sons in Beirut, and he was banned to come back to his village and to his job.
Fascinating, thank you. And we have another question, and this may be the last one. And it asks, what sources were used to shed light on the role of Palestinian women working with Dorothy Garrod at Tabun Cave? Where are these archives and who has studied them?
In fact, Pamela Smith, thanks to Pamela Smith and also another scholar, British scholars, who uncovered the story of Yusra and her role in the early excavations carried out at Shukba Cave and also in the Galilee in Tabun. There is, of course, this is a very interesting story. The archive of the great archaeologist, British archaeologist Garrod, which was, by the way, one of the first women archaeologists in England. Her archive was studied in 1996 by Pamela Smith, and it was a very interesting story regarding this archive, which was everybody thought that it was lost and it was found in a certain place in France. And she found, that was one of the stories. Yusra case was one of the stories which has been taken out of this archive. This is a fairly recent story, and I would say that it is moving and touching, that because it has to do also with the role of women in archaeology in Palestine.
Thank you so much. And I believe Felicity has maybe a follow-up or some information for us.
There's also a great organization called Trailblazers, which looks, it's a British organization which looks to highlight the work of women archaeologists throughout the world. But the Middle East has quite a few women archaeologists, and I think Yusra features there alongside Dorothy Garrod. And we have the BSAJ archive here in the PEF, and I don't know if there's much particularly, but there may be a little bit of material relating to Yusra and her work in the Tabun caves embedded in those archives. We're not quite sure.
We may have lost our speaker for a moment here. Dr. Hamdan, are you still there?
Yes, I would like to thank you for organizing this.
Is it okay to ask one final question?
Yeah, please, sure.
So this is from Dr. Melissa Craddock, who is our curator at the BSAJ Museum. And she asks if you could explain for the audience how archaeology today in the Palestinian territories works. Who controls access to cultural heritage sites and materials? This is in the Palestinian Authority.
Yeah, following the interim agreement in 1995, Department of Antiquities was established within the Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities in charge of the material culture, which means archaeology, historic buildings, and immaterial culture is the responsibility of the Ministry of Culture. Since 1995, a wide range of excavation has been carried out, and I was honored to be in charge for 2 decades about this department as a Director General of the Department of Antiquities. Part of the story is published by myself and other colleagues, and it can be accessed on my academia site. There is a series of articles about documenting the evolution and the development of archaeological work in Palestine, including archaeological excavation, and which has been carried out by this department.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for a fascinating paper and for a really interesting question and answer session as well. So informative. So it's my pleasure just to kind of wrap things up, and of course to thank Dr. Hamdan Taha for this wonderful information that he's presented to our audience today, and for giving us such great insights into the archaeology from that period, from the local perspective. And it's my pleasure also to announce that next month on February 24th, also at 9 a.m. California time, we will be hearing another presentation. This one will be from Mahmoud Hawari, also in Palestine as well. So we hope that the audience can tune in, and we're looking forward to furthering our series on unsilencing the archives. So thank you all very much for attending and for presenting, and we look forward to continuing this series